Dr. Phil Price. Is it Dr. Philip Price? Is your government name Philip?
It is Philip, but not
Dr.
many people
Philip
call me Philip.
Price. That's too many
I'm in
P's.
trouble.
Dr. Philip Price. Philip Price.
Yeah, Phil's better.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, no, the shortening to Phil made sense for anyone that struggles with too many P's at once, as I do, by drinking too much caffeine. We are going to talk about research in hybrid training and touch a little bit on the kind of origins of where the thread on the idea started to get pulled, and most importantly, what research Phil, who is an academic in the space, believes is missing, because it's a very new concept. It's a very quickly developing concept, something we discussed recently in another podcast. And with that in mind, there is a lot of things that may be missing that can be referenced when making certain claims, but that is kind of the explorative phase that we're in, which is very, very exciting. So Phil, just because people love credentials, why don't you share yours with us, first of all?
Sure. I'm the course lead for the Strength and Conditioning Masters that we have at St Mary's University, and I research in the area of concurrent training and also training in microgravity as well, but that's kind of like my separate part.
Yeah, Phil is basically an interstellar bro, is kind of how I describe him now. That's pretty much it. How can astronauts be as jacked as possible is what Phil's true passion is. That and Tony Hawk's Skaters 1, 2, and GoldenEye on PS1.
Oh, of course.
Am I right in saying? Yes.
Oh,
yes.
the N64.
Interesting. So, you've also written a book called The Science of Hybrid Training, and I'm sure you learnt an awful lot about what research there was and what research there wasn't in that. So let's break it down. Is it fair of me to say, Phil, from a research perspective, the first academic exploration of this concept, i.e. balancing progress in opposing strength and endurance disciplines, was with Professor Holosi and the interference effect? Is that kind of where this first originated in terms of how do we assess the impact of one on the other?
Yeah, it was a guy called Robert Hickson who was part of Holosi's research group. And he was actually a powerlifter, but Holosi was a very renowned exercise physiologist and a runner. So Holosi would actually go for a run in the afternoon, and Robert Hickson would join him to impress the new boss. But over time, Robert Hickson noticed that his powerlifting numbers started to stagnate. He started to see decreases in performance, and actually raised with his superior, like, I'm doing my strength training, but I'm also doing this running, and I'm seeing it affecting my strength training. What do you think of this? And he went, that should be your first. It should be your first study when you get your own lab, and that's exactly what he did. And it was that famous study which the title highlights interference. It has the word interference in it, where it relates to the effect of endurance training and strength performance. And that particular study had 3 groups. One was only doing strength training, the other only doing endurance training, and then the third group that actually did both. So they did the strength sessions and the endurance sessions with about 2 hours of rest in between. And what he noticed that in the combined group, at around 7 weeks to 8, it started to have a bit of a plateau in terms of their squat performance. And by the end of the 11 weeks, it actually saw a decrease in performance. So he concluded that the reason that squatting performance or squat strength started to decrease, whereas in the strength-only group it didn't, was because of that addition of endurance training. The idea that endurance training actually negatively influences squat development or strength development. So there's been years of research from that particular study looking at the mechanisms behind what could be causing that. So they've looked at the molecular side of things, they've looked at different performance variables which you can obviously utilize when devising a training program, changes in volume, frequency, exercise type, rest and recovery, all of those type of things. And it kind of spawned this research area of concurrent training. And that's where we are at today, because now with the emergence of actually what happens if you pursued strength and endurance sports simultaneously, we're actually pushing, asking questions regarding hybrid training. So this is where we're at now. So we're at in its infancy, but we are starting to get going.
There has been a meta-analysis on the interference effect, hasn't there? However, I think we can all agree, anyone with a strength and conditioning brain or a training brain, anyone that's lived through trying to balance these things, even if they've just been making it up as they go along, the problem with Robert Hickson's structure was that it was poor programming. And more than likely, the 7-week plateau was as a result of poor programming more than this interference effect at that point. Obviously, had we got to 12 weeks, that's where it maybe would have occurred. But I believe that is where the myth of cardio kills your gains, bro, you can't build strength and endurance concurrently, will have started to develop. But it came from poor and inefficient programming rather than on and an off switch belief that even until recently, academically and generally was considered to be the case, because mTOR is not turned off when balancing strength and endurance training. It's blunted. The percentage decrease in adaptation and therefore outcome that will be yielded by blunting mTOR can't really be measured. But I think we can probably both agree, Phil, the research indicates it's pretty minimal. It definitely exists, but that is a compromise that any quote-unquote hybrid athlete is willing to embrace by virtue of being a hybrid athlete with specific strength and endurance goals. In the same way, downregulation of AMPK is not an on and an off switch. It's downregulated. How much? Does it go from 100 to 0, hypothetically speaking? Does it go from 100 to 93? I don't think we know, unless there's something I've missed. But I think the important thing to consider is that the meta-analysis does exist. The interference effect does exist. But for 99.9% of people that are pursuing strength and endurance goals recreationally, it's not something they need to worry about if they bear in mind a few key programming considerations. So not to fall into the same trap of just working too hard and accumulating too much fatigue like Group C did in that initial study.
Yeah, I think a lot of the confusion comes from how the interference effect was originally defined, because Hickson always talked about, it was the addition of the endurance training. Well, like you said, it wasn't the greatest program we know now. Back then, not so. It was the 80s, or 1980 it got published, so it would have been late 70s. And if you did had that comparison between a strength-only group versus a hybrid training group, say that the difference is, I don't know, the concurrent training group strength development was 80% of what the strength-only group had made. That difference between the two, they're saying that's the interference effect. Well, that difference could come from so many different things, including factors which can influence strength-only training or single sport-only training, like fatigue and all of those types of things. So I think the idea of mTOR really picking up speed and people really relating to it in terms of like, that's the key thing that's causing this interference effect. I think it did come from, those original studies where they, measured it in mice and found that it did pretty much turn it off like a switch. But they made that transfer to humans where it doesn't actually make that difference. That we've done plenty of studies now which have really seen that both mTOR and AMPK can be elevated at the same time, and even though mTOR is starting to decrease, it's not necessarily concurrent with the sudden rise in AMPK. You'd like to think it would go down a little bit more. So the amount of inhibiting is still under question, and it might be the type of endurance training that you're doing, all of those types of things. There's so many different factors that can influence this. It's interesting that people have really latched on to a few things, because I say the thing that's going to cause an interference effect is poor concurrent training programming. End of. And it's only until that you're a very, very good hybrid athlete, I'd say like yourself, like your level, that you might have to be very, very smart, because you increase the risk of a potential interference effect. It doesn't mean you're not going to improve, but you see a risk. And because you're still improving, you probably wouldn't even notice it. So that's particularly if you're a novice. So that's where people probably shouldn't be leaning into it too much.
I think there is a bit of a counterculture that's really latching on and emphasising the interference effect's existence. I mean, yeah, I don't think either of us are disagreeing that it exists, but is it something that really should be considered for the vast majority of us? No. And again, there are no professional hybrid athletes. So until you get to that real top end where you have to exist like you're a Petri dish, it's not really as much of a consideration as I think it was previously believed to be, or some people now consider it to be. The meta-analysis, is it robust, in your opinion? Is there enough in it to quantify factoring the interference effect into a strength and conditioning, concurrent training setting for, let's say, rugby players, NFL athletes, something like that? Or do you think there's still more work to be done?
I think because there was a meta-analysis that came out in 2012 and found that strength, hypertrophy, and explosive strength were impeded to a certain level when comparing to strength-only groups. More recent meta-analyses coming out in 2023, 2022, found that actually, with more studies that we've now done, the effect on strength and hypertrophy isn't as pronounced as we first thought. More so on explosive strength. And that kind of makes sense because the more different types of training you do, it affects you in different ways with acute fatigue. So, it's affecting those real like type 2X factors which get fatigued easily. So it's harder to maintain progress in more high speed movement. That's why, a hybrid athlete that's doing weightlifting as their strength part is, really quite challenging for the athlete because, the speed of movement is really quite affected by fatigue,
And effort is not a currency that carries you as far as it does in other disciplines. Essentially, if your CP system isn't available, you're not going to move as quickly. You're not going to jump as high. You're not going to jump as far. All these things, and you can't just grit your teeth and go again. There needs to be a replenishment, doesn't there?
Yeah, exactly. But there's plenty of research to show that now there are key variables that probably have the most impact when it comes to ant interference, and we can just kind of avoid them by planning the week very effectively. By utilizing strength before endurance is probably a common one. And if they are particularly intense sessions, then having some form of recovery between them is probably important. That's what I would recommend. Because if mTOR is elevated and you want to keep AMPK away from it, like it's probably going to be subsided by 6 to 12 hours. And the level of mTOR is going to be completely dependent on certain things like the type of training you did and also the level of the athlete. Like if you just did a moderately intense strength training session, but you've got a huge history of strength training, your mTOR is probably going to be not that much elevated because you've adapted to it. You need a really strong stimulus to get that mTOR to be high enough for it ever to be affected by some raise in AMPK anyway. So training history affects it a lot as well.
I think the only time I've contextually truly experienced it to the point where I've had to go back to the drawing board and approach things differently from how I theoretically set them up in the first place was the 500-pound squat and sub 5-minute mile, because of the fatigue from one to the other, whereby the predictability of that impact was so difficult to track, even with logic, where the smallest bit of bad sleep or stress or sitting in the car for too long at a certain angle or whatever it might be was the difference between a good session and a bad session. I mean, the best example I can give is I had 190 for a set of 4 that was programmed, and I failed my last warm-up at 175. I just got to the bottom position and just literally had nothing. I went to accelerate out of the bottom and I was like, wow, I am dead. Should I even go to the track? Probably not. Maybe I'll just rest this week. Got to the track and it was the best track session I'd had in the 6-week prep to that point. And I went, hang on, this is confusing. I was assuming that this was systemic fatigue rather than a little bit more localized. And then, okay, right, how do I separate these sessions? What's the session order? What do I concentrate on what day, et cetera, et cetera? How do I spread this volume over the course of the week, et cetera? All these questions that I love asking and exploring. That's where I felt it the most. And I think one of the key tenets that we really encourage people to consider is, if you can, play strength before endurance. If you can't, then don't. Because the key detail is, for the vast majority of athletes we work with, and even for the vast majority of things that I take on, doing the training is more important than the order in which you do the training from a consistent point of view. If it means that you're constantly going to be doing hard effort intervals before doing heavy back squats on the same day, and you can't flip that around, then we might reassess the order across the week, because the consolidation of stresses is something that's key. But if you're going into heavy back squats and we're working off certain percentages of 1RM, 1 week we're under fatigue, the other week we're not, and we're trying to build linearly, it becomes a little bit more difficult. But practicality and adherence to training is more important than the order in which the training is done. So I think practicality outweighs the interference effect, personally.
Oh, every time. Like, the most important things are consistency and intent of training. So, whatever structure during the week kind of works, then that's going to be the best training structure. Because, if you don't train, you're not going to improve, regardless of an interference effect is there or not. Like, people are putting way too much emphasis on it, because if you go back to those original data and let's say arbitrarily hybrid training, you get 80% of the gains of a strength only training. Like, how do you physically know that you are 20% less than if you were, well, you know what, I squatted such and such a day, but if I didn't do my endurance training, I would have got this. Like, it's almost irrelevant, because especially with how I like to program, it's kind of like slow and steady over time. So you're almost programming your own interference effect, because you're deliberately not trying to accelerate too much. And that's one of the problems with Hickson's original study, is because he pushed him too hard too soon. It wasn't necessarily that there was an interference effect because they added endurance training. It was just that they did too much, and if they had reduced the volume of both strength and endurance but kept it combined, and the rate of improvement in strength was, the line is not as aggressively steep, then over time we're going to catch up with the strength only lot anyway. So
if you started training for a 5K and you did 8x800s 3 days a week at RP9, you'd very quickly be fucked. And that's not the interference effect. That's being fucked from doing too much volume, which is, well, too much intensity and in too much volume. So pushing too hard too soon, as you've said. And that's kind of effectively what happened, because I don't know if you mentioned it earlier, but just to highlight, the A group was doing, it was 5x5 or 5x5 at around 80% squats, wasn't it? 3 times a week. I know it was leg press, wasn't it? Or was there a leg press component?
I think, no, because there was 5 sessions, 3 of them were squats, 2 were leg press.
Yes, okay, so it was squats and leg press. So 5x5 at a decent weight.
Yeah, but I think it was like lift as much as you can for the reps.
Yeah,
there was structure over 8 weeks. It was just
progression, no linear build. Whereas the B group, which was running only, I think it was 30 to 45 minutes of max effort running 3 times a week, wasn't it?
Yeah, and 3 cycling.
And 3 cycling. And then was the cycling easier, or was it still full send?
Full send.
Full send. So 6 full sends.
As hard and as far as you can in the time given.
Which is somewhat through auto-regulation accounting fatigue, but it's encouraging you to sit in zone 3 at the very least, isn't it? And then the C group was both. I'd be fucked after 3 days doing that. So it's amazing that people lasted as long as they did with 7 weeks. But that's why we highlighted that the programming component wasn't great, because it was pushing people too hard too soon. And as Phil has highlighted many, many times in the past, the best athlete is the one that can train with intent for the longest and most consistent period of time without injury, disruption, illness, etc., etc., etc. Nothing sets back training progress more than an operation that's caused through training too hard, for example. So making sure that you build linearly, progressively, with intent, with intelligent programming, and understanding how you can manipulate that to get the most practical outcome possible over the most sustained period of time is what we're trying to help people do at Omnia. That is the aim, and that is what, until very recently, I had been managing to do for about 10 years, and then my hip decided to say, "You've taken the piss for far too long, Fergus. Have a little punch in the face." But I'm back running again, so happy days.
Nice. How's that feel?
It's nice, I'm still not 100% confident. I don't, like, as soon as I see anything 430 per K or faster, I just have this kind of voice in my head that says you're gonna crack your hip again. But I am shocked at how efficient I feel running cardiovascularly having not ran for 3.5 months, but with decent bike volume. Musculoskeletally, I felt inefficient, sluggish, heavy, but the zone 2, for about 3 years, my zone 2 was pretty consistently between 5:15 and 5:30 per K. And that would deteriorate a little bit to 5:45 over time. But that was my range, generally speaking. Influenced by fatigue and sort of weather, humidity, all that sort of stuff, obviously. But that was that. Whereas now, 4:45 to 4:55, having not ran for three months, the cycling has allowed me to maintain that once I've broken the inertia with the musculoskeletal adaptation again, which is amazing. So it's crazy how tight my quads and IT bands are when I finish the run, and actually feel it during a little bit, because I've gone so many years without having a serious injury where I've had to take time off like that. I've obviously reduced volume in certain areas, but it's very interesting how musculoskeletally inefficient I feel versus how efficient I feel with the turnover of my lungs and my heart, which is fascinating. So we just cycling is an absolute godsend for low impact cardiovascular adaptation, which I'm sure you won't disagree with as a statement. So
particularly for heavier athletes.
Yeah. Kieran and I spoke about this last week on a podcast which went out on Thursday the 9th. Today it went out, actually, as we're recording this. How convenient. And we both had really interesting results after many, many years of training of, by virtue of practicality, doing less running but doing more cycling, and ended up being quite surprised at the outcome. So I think there's a real ego and convention battle that you might need to go through, where I think we could see in the next couple of years heavier athletes doing less and less volume for better and better marathon results through more effectively utilizing cross training. Because I've been taught a huge amount about how I would approach my next marathon prep based on the last one. So yeah, I'm glad I got injured. It gave me some very, very valuable lessons, and it allowed me to reconnect with my love for two wheels until I had to start getting them serviced or got punctures, and then I wanted to throw them off many, many cliffs. So before I start talking about how much I hate bike admin, which I can talk about for a long time, what did you learn in the process of writing your book? Because obviously you're up to speed on the research, you'd spoken to lots and lots of people on the podcast in the past, but were there any things that surprised you in actually going on that journey? Were there any things that really fascinated you? What were the big takeaways from the actual process of bringing the book to life that you want to highlight?
I think the process that I enjoyed most was how much I wanted to blend the research and the research findings, but also with practicality and good coaching recommendations based on principles. So I didn't want to provide like a training program at the end of the book, but I wanted to provide some principles and sound rationale for those principles so that people could take them and utilize them in creating their own hybrid training. And the bit I liked by doing that, it allowed me a bit of flexibility to highlight the importance of making decisions, of utilizing knowledge from the literature, but also our own understanding of ourselves, athletes, and practicality. There's even a bit in the book where I talk around reasons for like molecular physiology and why you may have a gap between two sessions. And then when it came to like the practical book, and I talk about double training session days, I argue for and against combining strength and endurance training, because I think there are times when you will need to separate strength and endurance training on the same day, but there's also many times where you probably just combine them. Like one of the key things people keep forgetting is that if you did do strength and then you did your endurance straight after, like regardless of intensity and all of that, you get a full 24 hours likely before you then train again. Whereas if you split them apart on your day, you're then only getting 12 hours of recovery after the last session before your next one the next day. And people don't really take that into account. So there are key things where I even had to write in that chapter. It's like, look, I've made this recommendation here, and you'll be surprised why am I saying this, because I go against some of the recommendations I made in earlier chapters. But there's a key reason for that. I think I got an Amazon review which didn't agree with it because, they're going against what they said in their previous chapters. It's like, yeah, there's a reason for it, because there's a time when you need to follow the literature, and there's a time when you need to not follow it. And those that are good at doing that know the literature inside and out and have experience working with athletes, you know?
And what is that normally elicited as a result of? Practicality tends to be the outcome there, doesn't it? That tends to be the thing that warrants disregarding the literature for the sake of being able to do the thing in the first place.
Oh, well, one of them is consistency is king, and of the principles that I mentioned in the book. So I'm constantly trying to refer back to these principles and as to why, and allowing people to make good informed decisions, keeping to those principles, but having a sound understanding of the research is important, but so is, knowing when to not follow it.
So, what's missing? If you could give me, this is a horrible question to give an academic without any preparation, but I'm going to do it anyway, Phil, sorry. If you could give me 3 basic titles for 3 studies you would like to see developed in the space of hybrid training, what would those studies be?
Well, I don't know if I could give you titles, but I could give you areas that I would definitely like to look at.
We'll compromise on areas, given I've shafted you here, Phil. That's very fair. Yes,
that's fine. I would like to do more research on those that are considered more elite in terms of hybrid training, because a lot of the research utilizes, let's say, moderately trained athletes that come from multidisciplinary sports. And I think the elite athletes are the ones that are able to deal with developing enough tension in the muscle to provide force for their strength lot, but also have the ability for the muscle to relax to allow better movement of oxygenated blood to and from the muscle for their endurance training. So typically, those that are stronger can generate a lot of tension in the muscle, which is great, but that's over like 1 rep or multiple reps. But when you're doing endurance training, we're going rep, 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 rep with each step. Your muscle needs to be on, then off, then on, then off. And if you're good at providing tension but can't relax, oxygenated blood is going to get to the muscle, but it's going to be poor at getting back, because when the muscle contracts, it kind of acts like a tourniquet with the capillaries which surround the muscle fibers. So if that deoxygenated blood isn't getting back, you're going to get the kind of like the pooling within the, when the muscle feels full, doesn't it? And it feels like it can't contract as well. You're going to get that. So I want to know how, from a muscle physiology level, why athletes like yourself are very good at that. So that's probably an area that I'd want to look at. I'd probably expand on what Gomar at WOD Science is doing, where they're looking at differences between organising either strength one day, endurance the next day, and mixing like that, versus actually having double sessions on the same day. I'm currently working with a PhD student who's developing his idea on this particular area, so that's going to be quite exciting. So definitely organising of strength and endurance training throughout the week, where they separate by days, having it together, those types of things. Number 3. I would like to know more about the effect of mTOR and AMPK. The unfortunate bit is I'm not a molecular scientist, so I might need some help and collaboration from other institutions. But the reason being, I've been fascinated by a paper which had 2 groups. You had powerlifters and you had cyclists. And they both did a training session. One was strength, one was endurance. And what they found is with the powerlifters, they did the strength session, but it was kind of only like leg extensions at a certain percentage. And they had like 0 response of mTOR. It was because the stimulus for them was so low, because they're so well trained in strength. So clearly training history has a massive effect, whereas the cyclists who don't do much strength training saw a huge increase in mTOR. So clearly, your training history makes a massive effect. So we're talking about, AMPK blunts mTOR. Well, we need to know what training actually wakes up mTOR first before we know how much AMPK might start inhibiting it. So, that's why I, in the book, I talk a lot around particular hot sessions. There are going to be sessions of the week which are going to generate a real strong physiological adaptation that's probably going to create the most acute fatigue from them because you're training really hard, they're the ones you want to protect. So maybe that will increase an mTOR response, and we want to be careful of that and move endurance training away from it to protect it. Things like that. So training history is definitely somewhere I'd like to investigate.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because to get quality data, you need quality participants, and giving cyclists leg extensions versus powerlifters leg extensions, even I, a non-academic, would go, hang on, that's not apples and apples here. This is very different. In the same way, if you asked, what's his name, Colton Engelbrecht, the 23-year-old powerlifter that's going to break every world record ever, if you asked him to sit on a bike and do an FTP test, the systemic fatigue response that would come from that and the energy system demand that would come from that versus a recreational cyclist would be astronomically different. But if you asked him to squat 100 kilos, it would be the equivalent of him putting sugar in his tea in terms of demand. It would be just so vastly different. But that is the challenge. And I guess how much of research in the modern world is inhibited by practical limitations of the execution of the project itself, in terms of participation, in terms of funding, in terms of being able to get people in the right place to measure in the right way, in terms of having the right tools available to you, in terms of having the right check-in features with certain people in different places. How much of a demand? Well, I guess my question is, how much of the inefficiencies of research data is as a result of the system in which they operate in versus the wrong questions being asked?
And we can go in a real rabbit hole if we start talking about the limitations of science. But in terms of linking it back to sort of participant level, you're right. Very difficult to get hold of because you might want to do certain testing and you need to get them to the lab or whatever it might be. So there's a lot of logistical things which can be quite difficult. I think, Gomar at World Science is doing some good things with some of the elite CrossFit athletes, where he's taken the lab to them, and I think that's an option that we can start to look at. I think, a lot of the research is utilizing athletes that let's say moderately trained, which probably provides really good findings, but for that level of athlete. So if we start making decisions for your programming based off of a study which had me as the participant, it probably won't be able to generate as something that can be generalized to you as well as it could be. So more we can do with better athletes, the better. But obviously that's difficult because, if I asked you to be in a research study, you'd be like, well, then I've got to, I'm already training for something. I need to stop that training to do this other thing, and you won't want to do that, understandably. So you then start to think, well, okay, let's start monitoring a load of metrics as you progress, and you get N=1 type studies, but a very elite level participant. So it can be really quite beneficial, but you have less control over the initial question because it's been controlled by the training.
Yeah, and an individual for the most part, because you can't having 2 people, 3 people, 4 people on the same track of programming is very difficult in this setting to facilitate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which again is limitations of science. Will be a topic for another time, Phil. Don't worry. But on that, the molecular side of things that you mentioned earlier, I assume that comes with higher demands in terms of funding, robust testing pools, etc., to be able to ask and answer those questions. So to be able to better understand AMPK and mTOR relationship within this setting, is that I wouldn't know actually how that is measured, what tools are required, what universities have those tools, etc. What were the questions that you would ask within that relationship, and what would you need to bring that study to life?
In terms of, so one of the key things I think would be interesting to ask would be the type of endurance training and how that might impact any inhibition of mTOR from AMPK. a friend of mine called Dr. Tom Jones. He is up in Northumbria, and he did a study where he looked at moderate, kind of 70% VO2 max endurance compared to more high intensity interval type training, and how that influenced mTOR. And the results didn't necessarily show that the high intensity interval training had some inhibitory effect on mTOR, but statistically it was heading in that direction. Whereas for the sort of 70% of VO2 max moderate state endurance training, it didn't. So clearly, I think, although these data don't necessarily fully show it because there was no statistical difference, that intensity might be a factor here. Now, there's other things that could. Was it intense enough? Was it intense and long enough? What were the quality of the athletes like? There's a number of different things that could actually influence it, but it gave some inkling that something could be there for further investigation. So
interesting.
Maybe I'll develop a relationship with Northumbria. And
there we go. Yeah. If anyone's listening, how's it measured? Is it measured through blood?
Yeah. I've never actually personally done
it. Is it sort of lactate mechanism, or does it require drawing blood?
Drawing blood. Like the best way of doing it is biopsy.
Right. Okay. Cool. Yeah. It's so that comes with inherent challenges in and of itself, doesn't it? So
you need certain qualifications.
Yeah. These are questions I would like answered as well. They're all very interesting, because I think the big question that I'd love to have clarity on, we've already highlighted, which is to what degree backwards from optimal or single discipline is the blunting effect in terms of adaptation. Is it a 7% loss in general terms? Is it a 40% loss? Can you even measure the loss? Because as you've said, unless the same individual is doing single discipline only training, essentially you can't measure both. It's either or. So how could we ever come to that conclusion? But that would be a very robust rebuttal of, we don't need to worry about the interference effect because it only affects us by this percentage. Therefore, get on with your training and stop worrying about the interference effect. But because it's vague and grey, it will continue to be a discussion. Yeah. So do you think that question could be answered?
Yes, but it's so multifactorial that having a very distinct, like, if you do this, you're going to have a 77% reduction, versus if you did this, it'll be a 20%. Like there will still be estimates and ranges, I think, rather than very specific values for that.
And then genetics, epigenetics, all of this stuff comes into it, and it just becomes an absolute minefield. You know what? I've made my brain hurt even thinking about the multifactorial considerations of said question. So you give me a call when we've made some progress on this, Phil, and I'll happily listen to the conclusion. But any of the
multiverse of molecular science.
The Marvel Avengers of hybrid training research. For anyone that's interested in a PDF with all of the research considerations on hybrid training, then it is linked in the description on YouTube. And can it be linked in the description in the show notes? Can links go there anymore? I'm not sure. If they can, they'll be there. If not, go to YouTube. You should go to YouTube anyway, in fact. So thank you very much. And Phil, we will speak again very soon on some other topics, but we'll put on hold the limitations of science for a while, because I feel like that's something I need to spend a lot more time reading on before I can even consider asking questions or going toe-to-toe with you on that topic. But that's that. I think for anyone that wants to understand the discussion we've had today in a bit more depth, with a bit more flow and considerations from it, then please do check out Phil's book, The Science of Hybrid Training, as it breaks down the science of hybrid training. This is really, really quite clear and concise marketing. So well done there, Phil. And if you want to go and leave a positive Amazon review to help the negative Amazon reviewer understand nuance, then please go and do so, as it would be much appreciated by all of us. Thank you very much. And we'll speak again soon, Phil.
Thank you, Fergus. Enjoyed it.